Huh?
Well, we'll try to get this started more or less on time. Welcome to the inaugural Spriggs Family Lecture. Both of those who are here in Skaggs Hall, as well as those who are viewing it live stream on YouTube. My name is Lawson. I'm a member of the Economics Department, and I'm also the organizer for tonight's lecture. Before thanking some of the attendees tonight and introducing tonight's speaker, I'd like to take a moment for all of you to make sure that you silence your cell phone, silence mine, because that can be quite interrupting. Those students who are attending for extra credit, hopefully you picked up an extra credit slip, attendance slip, as you entered tonight. If you didn't, fill one out as you leave. We will be picking them up as you leave. If you have to leave before the Q&A session is finished, and this should only take up 70 to 75 minutes tonight, so less than or equal to a normal class. But if you have to leave early, please try to do so as quietly as possible. We appreciate it. The Spriggs Family Endowment for Free Market Studies was created last year from a generous donation by the family of Scott and Lynette Spriggs to Boise State's College of Business and Economics. The purpose of the endowment is to fund a yearly lecture series, a yearly lecture, bringing a prominent economist to Boise State to discuss the nature, attributes, and outcomes of market processes. Scott and Lynette are with us tonight, and please join me in thanking them for their generous. I would also like to recognize Dean Mark Bannister of the College of Business and Economics, whose vision and leadership helps make events like these possible for you as students as well as the general public. Thank you, Mark. Although it's not in my notes, I also want to thank my department chair, Annie Walker. Annie. She's huge support for me and this lecture series, as well as the other two, which the Economics Department carries out. Tonight's speaker is Robert Lawson, the Jerome and Fullinwider Endowed Chair in Economic Freedom and the Director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom at SMU, Cox School of Business. Evidently, I'm not supposed to say Methodist anymore. So SMU's Cox School of Business. Professor Lawson is a founding co-author and editor of the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index. And it's an annual report. The first one came out in 1996, which surveyed economic freedom from 1975 to 1995, and it's been produced annually since then. Professor Lawson has authored or co-authored over 100 journal articles, book chapters, policy reports, and book reviews. With Benjamin Powell of Texas Tech University, he is the co-author of the Amazon bestseller, Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. And his research has been cited in over 12,000 times, according to Google Scholar. Dr. Lawson is past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education, a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, and a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. He has won the Adam Smith Award from the Association of Private Enterprise Education. I think it was your acceptance speech that convinced me that you would be a decent guest. Tonight's lecture presents the most recent evidence on the relationship between economic freedom and the wealth and health of nations. Please join me in welcoming Bob Lawson.
Thank you very much, Alan. We tried to schedule this when the Florida State Seminoles, my other alma mater, one of my alma maters was coming, and I think it got COVIDed out, so we didn't play that game. But my goal was to come and see the blue field. But we did drive by this afternoon and it was closed, but I could see right through the window. I did get a little glimpse of the blue field, so that's a bucket list item for me, being the football fan that I am. Thank you all for coming. I know coming out to lectures like this is mostly about the extra credit, so make sure you turn in your extra credit, folks. All right. I want to talk a little bit to start about why I got involved in the project that the Fraser Institute in Canada publishes called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. But I want to sort of set up the stage for why I've devoted my career to this index, to this project. You know, we're having a great debate. We're continuously having a great debate about how we should organize our economic system. On the one hand, we have a fellow like Adam Smith, and he's my hero. Boise State is not paying me enough to wear a tie tonight, but if I was wearing a tie, it would be an Adam Smith tie, almost certainly. And Adam Smith's my hero, and he wrote a book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, which was a great year for other reasons. And in that book, he argued that we should have a system of natural liberty. That was his phrase, system of natural liberty. That's not a phrase that really rings, sounds right to us. It's kind of old-fashioned. But what he meant by that is what today we would call laissez-faire, free enterprise, free markets, private enterprise, something like that. And what that means, of course, is private property, markets, buying and selling, stuff like that hopefully they teach here in the School of Business. And Adam Smith was no utopian, but he thought that system of natural liberty, that it would work pretty good. The wealth of the nation, hence the title of the book, the wealth of the nation would be larger, we'd be richer, we'd be happier, lots of good things would happen. So that was Adam Smith. And then a few generations later, though, this guy Marx came along, and he argued that Smith and the economists like Smith, he called them classical economists, the classical economists like Smith, they were all wrong. And I don't know that I doubt at least in the business school they teach a lot of Marxian economics, but I'm pretty sure they do over in the English department. And forgive me for saying that, but it's probably true. And Marx had a lot of complaints. If you've studied Marx's economics, he argued that capitalism, that was his favorite term for this system of natural liberty, he called it capitalism. Marx argued that system would be bad. It would have all kinds of negative consequences. There would be unemployment, business cycles, monopoly, exploitation of the poor. In fact, according to Marx, the system of natural liberty that Adam Smith called it, or capitalism that as Marx called it, that system would be so horrific, so bad for so many people that eventually the working class would rise up and violently overthrow their capitalist overlords. And so we have this one guy, Adam Smith, my hero, the founder, by most accounts, the founder of economics, as we call it today. And then we have this guy, Marx, incredibly well-known, influential. And one guy, Adam Smith, says free markets work pretty good. We should have those. And the other guy says, no, they don't. They're terrible. So that's the debate. And we've been having this debate for a long time. We're still having that debate. I was an undergraduate at Ohio University, so go Bobcats. And Ohio U is a bit of a party school. We're always on the lists that come out every year. Very proud of that as an alum. And we would argue, I was a young Adam Smith guy. I was wearing Adam Smith ties in college. That's how weird I was. And my friends many of my friends were socialists. Actually, some of my friends were communists. I mean that literally. They would wear red armbands on May Day and march through campus with pictures of Mao. This was the 80s. It was a little different back then than it is today. And we would argue with each other into the evening, frequently with the help of alcohol. And those are my fondest memories of Ohio University. I've forgotten everything my professors taught me, as you will. But I remember those evenings and those wonderful times talking to my friends, most of whom were leftists. Leftists are more fun than young Republicans, so I hang out with the leftists. And at the end of the day, though, I remember a lot of arguments like the folks you see there. We'd have a beer, and they'd call me a capitalist pig, and I'd call them a commie pinko, and we'd drink another beer, and the name calling and the finger pointing. It's like Facebook before we had Facebook. Back in the old days, we did Facebook face-to-face. This is not like today. But at the end of my 3 years, I graduated early. I was precocious like that. At the end of my 3 years at Ohio University, I don't think any of my friends who were socialists became free market advocates, and they had no influence on me. Those were my fondest memories of college, but no one was convinced by my arguments. And I'd like to contrast that experience, which I think that experience characterizes how most of us engage each other when we talk about these big ideas, capitalism versus socialism, free markets versus government planning or whatever. When we talk about these things, there's a lot of name calling, there's a lot of heat, and it can be fun, but there's not a lot of light, and there's not a lot of actual convincing going on. I'd like to contrast that with the natural sciences. Now, I'm a frustrated natural scientist myself. If I was a little bit smarter, maybe 10 more IQ points, I'd be a physicist. And I still like going to physics lectures, and I read papers, and the physics department at SMU is very kind to invite me, and I pretend that I know what they're talking about. But I like the natural sciences because there are arguments in the natural sciences. I go to physics department seminars, and they're arguing with each other. They don't agree on this or that. They see some data, they don't agree on it. So one person thinks this is what's going on, another person thinks that, and they're arguing. But at the end of the day, in physics and chemistry and other natural sciences, how do they settle their arguments? They have arguments, but how do they settle them? They gather more data. They put a better telescope on top of a mountain or in space. They build a better super collider under the ground in Switzerland. They gather better data. And over the long run, that process of ideas colliding, gathering data, looking at how that data conforms or doesn't conform with the theories, that process, that iterative process, that scientific method thing we teach to junior high kids, it actually works. And we have learned an incredible amount about the way the natural world works. And we're living in this technologically marvelous age as a result of that process. What happens in economics and the social sciences? We're still doing that most of the time. You go to an economics department seminar, half the time it's just like, you're a commie pinko, you're a capitalist pig or something. We don't really get to the point. So I would like economics to be more like a social science, or be more like a natural science. There are deep differences between social sciences and natural sciences that I don't want to get into, but I would like us to be a little bit more like them, a little bit more data-centric, a little bit more humble about our theories. And so that brings me to the project. So we've got this battle of ideas between Smith and Marx. Marx says capitalism doesn't work. Smith says capitalism works. And we've been arguing about it, calling each other names. I would like to try to measure the degree to which a country, I'm going to use countries as my sort of unit of analysis, the thing I care about as a country. I'm going to try to measure how, I'm going to use the term economically free, but if you want to say how capitalistic a country is. How close does Canada, the United States, Botswana, Mauritius, how close do these countries come to Adam Smith's system of natural liberty? And I want to try to put a number on it. I want to measure it with a number, just like they do at CERN in Switzerland. I want to try to measure how free market countries are. That's the goal. Now that sounds pretty hard, and it's not super easy. If it was super easy, someone would have done it before we started doing it, but we measure things that are hard to measure all the time. Like we measure who the best college football team is. And even after we play the games, do we always agree on who the best team is? No, we don't. In the NFL's case, the best team lost. That's the Cincinnati Bengals, who dey, and all that. I'm not over it, so don't ask. We measure, if you've taken an economics class, we measure gross domestic product, GDP. And the definition of GDP is pretty straightforward. It's the dollar value of all the new final goods and services produced in a country in a year. And right after we teach what GDP is, we spend the entire rest of the class teaching our students about how it's a flawed measure, how it doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure here, it does measure this, but it's not supposed to, and all the problems with GDP. And GDP is a terribly flawed measure. We know it's flawed, and we do it anyway. Every year the Department of Commerce is going to measure GDP. And next year they're going to measure it again. It's going to be wrong next year too. And we're going to compare next year's wrong number with this year's wrong number, and we're going to call the difference economic growth, right? We think we're better off with a measure of the size of the American economy, even if we know that that measurement is going to be flawed. And I feel the same way about an economic freedom index. I want to try to measure how free market a place is. I know I'm not going to, it's not going to be like pure science. I'm not going to measure it nearly as precisely as, say, physicists measure the things that they measure, but I want to give it the old college try, and hopefully we'll learn something. The act of measuring how economically free or how capitalistic a country is, hopefully that process will at least give us a little bit of information that we didn't otherwise have. So let's talk about the index. I didn't bring a copy of the book. There's a PDF. I'll give you a URL later. But it's the world's most boring book. It's pages and pages and pages of tables of numbers. It's a massive data collection exercise. The index that we have has 42 variables. We have 165 countries currently in the index, and I have data back to 1970. And so it's a large data collection process. I'm trying to collect data, different types. I'll talk about the types in just a second, but it's a huge data thing, all about the numbers. And I'm not going to go through 42 variables. If I got to about 7 or 8, you would start walking out of the room because it'd be dull and no one wants to hear that. But I'm going to talk about the 5 areas of the index. So this 42 variables, but we got 5 sort of categories. And they're size of government, legal structure, property rights, money, international trade, and regulation. Those are the 5 areas. And we'll just give you a flavor for the kinds of things that go in the index. And we call it the Economic Freedom Index. I like to call it the Adam Smith Index. It's like, what would Adam Smith do? Do you remember Christian kids a few years ago had those What Would Jesus Do bracelets? Remember those? They were popular for about a week, and then they stopped wearing it. But I would like to have a What Would Adam Smith Do bracelet, because this index is really a sort of what would Adam Smith do bracelet, idea index. So size of government. How big should the government be? Like, I'm talking about taxes and spending. How much money should the government take from our paychecks and then spend? Adam Smith wrote a chapter in The Wealth of Nations on public finance. It's a pretty short chapter because Adam Smith was a pretty small government guy. If you read that chapter, Adam Smith thought the government should have an army and navy to keep the French from invading Britain. He was Scottish, but Scotland's part of Britain, though, so I think, yeah, so okay. And so an army and navy to protect the nation from foreign aggressors. He thought they should have cops to settle, like, bar fights. He's Scottish, so bar fights, right? So, have the police keep the peace. Have courts in case people disagree about who owns the cow, and rather than fight about who owns the cows in the streets, let's have a judge decide who owns the cow. So property disputes, different types of things like that would be settled by courts. So we've got an army and navy, we've got some cops, we've got some courts. He did talk a little bit about what we would sometimes call infrastructure today. Adam Smith had a very good understanding of the concept of public goods. If you've studied public goods in an economics class, Adam Smith actually really understood the nature of what we call public goods. But in his context, it was mostly roads and bridges. And so roads and bridges, okay, government can do that. And he talked a little bit about education. He was a little bit ambivalent about education and how much government should finance education. He thought students should pay for their own education for the most part, but he also thought there might be a role for the state to finance education. And then the chapter's over. That's it. So it's courts, cops, national defense, some roads, some bridges, and maybe some schools. And that's the end of the chapter. There is nothing else on Adam Smith's list of what government. So Adam Smith was a small government guy. Like, if you think about how big and all the things our governments do, old age pensions, welfare, a million trillion, recreation centers and pools, and you think about what governments actually do in the world, Adam Smith's size of government was a lot smaller, probably one order of magnitude smaller. So he's a small government guy. So in the the first area of the index, I go to the IMF and the World Bank, and it's all on the computer. I used to say books, but now it's all on computer. And you can find out how much money Botswana is taxing and spending, how much money is Mauritius taxing and spending, and so on. And the countries that that have more spending, that are bigger governments, that is to say they're further away from what Adam Smith would like. Adam Smith likes smaller governments. The ones with bigger governments, they get lower index scores. I use an advanced branch of mathematics called arithmetic to convert all the raw numbers into it's a 0 to 10 scale. So 10 is going to be Adam Smith, and 0 would be the opposite, I guess. So small governments, in terms of taxes and spending, they get better scores. So in the context of the index, Sweden's going to get a terrible score here, because everybody knows Sweden has a huge tax and spend apparatus. They tax and spend. Well over 50% of the economy is taxed by the Swedish government and then spent by the Swedish government. And so they get a pretty small score. a pretty bad score. I think they're a 2 out of 10 or something like that. The second area is legal structure of property rights. This is how secure is your property. A foundation to any system of capitalism or free markets is the idea that people can own their property. They own their land, their buildings, their factories, their bodies. And here we've got, this is hard to measure, but here I've got a couple different measures. One is from the World Bank where they measure, for example, if I gave Alan $5 to wash my car, and then Alan, because he's a flake, he doesn't wash my car, he takes my $5 and goes down to the pub and drinks a pint with it. He's almost a thief, really. If I contract with Alan to do a job and he doesn't do the job and I paid him for, he's almost like a criminal, like a thief. He's almost like a mugger. Suppose I took Alan to court in the United States and I said, Judge, I gave Alan $5 and here's the contract we wrote, and he's supposed to wash my car, and you can see my car is still dirty, so he didn't do the job. How long, according to the World Bank, they estimate how long it's going to take and how expensive it's going to be to settle that contract dispute. And they say in the United States it'll take about a year to settle it. I don't know if that's right. It might be longer in Manhattan and shorter in Dallas, or maybe, I don't know, Boise's probably pretty fast, but they say a year. In some places they say it takes 3 years. So where is my property right more secure? Well, it's more secure in a place that can settle that contract in 6 months than it is a place that will take 3 years to do it. So the length of time and the costliness of the legal system in settling contract is a variable that we use. And places where it's less expensive and you can settle disputes more quickly, those are the ones that get the better scores. Another thing, we use some survey data from the World Economic Forum. You may have heard of the World Economic Forum. They have that big meeting in Davos, Switzerland, every year. They do a survey of business people, and they ask them some sort of survey question type things like, hey, in your country, how secure are the property rights? It's kind of a subjective thing, but we use those numbers as well. And so we score countries on how good their legal system is in protecting people's property, enforcing contracts. Now the third area is we call it access to sound money. This is an area I didn't used to spend a lot of time on, but if you're paying any attention to the inflation news lately, it's going to be something we're going to talk about more and more in the next few years, I'm afraid. And you know, when I was, I got a story for this. When I was 16, my dad, he said, I had just gotten my driver's license, and he said, you should get $100. You know, notice he didn't give me $100. I didn't have that kind of dad. He said, you should get $100 and then put it in your wallet, you know, fold it up and hide it in some recessed pocket of your wallet and kind of forget about it. And you know, it's the 80s. I was driving a 1972 broken down Volkswagen Beetle, and it broke down all the time. And so $100 would be a tow truck or maybe a mechanic or maybe a bribe a cop, I don't know. But it was, you know, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have Visa cards back then. So $100 extra, you know, is like insurance in case you broke down on the road. And a year goes by, and I, of course, find the $100. I'm like, oh, I didn't need it, but I found the $100. And you know, we all know what the problem is. If I take that $100 to the store a year later, it's not going to be able to, it won't buy as much. If there's been 5% inflation this year, that $100 bill is only going to buy 95% as much stuff a year later as it would have bought the year before when I put it in my wallet. It's like someone took $5 out of it's like some thief took $5 out of my wallet. Now, it's not literally the thief. I mean, it's still literally the same $100 bill I had a year earlier, but it's like someone took $5 of purchasing power out of it. And monetary and financial economists talk about inflation acting like a tax, the inflation tax. Any asset, this gets a little bit, I sound like a professor now, but any asset that you have that's denominated in dollars, like, well, currency, but also mortgages, insurance contracts, bonds, any asset that's denominated in currency terms, inflation acts like a tax on the value of that asset. So Area 1 kind of measures IRS type taxes when they take money from the IRS. Area 2 rate kind of does like the Allen tax if he takes $5 from me and doesn't wash my car. Area 3 is the inflation tax. It's a different type of tax, which unfortunately we're all going to feel, I think, here pretty soon. So in this area, we measure monetary stability and price stability. We just gather data on inflation. It's a little bit more complicated than just inflation, but essentially those countries where the monetary system and the prices are more stable, those countries get better scores. And until very recently, most countries were doing pretty well. In the last few years, we've had a very stable worldwide monetary system, and almost everybody's getting 9s and 10s out of the 10-point scale, except for Venezuela, which got a 0. Everyone else pretty much gets a 10. Now, what we're going to see going forward is the numbers are going to start getting worse for some countries that are having inflation, like the United States. The fourth area is freedom to trade internationally, and this is the one I think, if you think about Adam Smith, this is probably the area that you should identify with Adam Smith most closely, because if there was one thing Adam Smith was known for, he was known for being a free trader. He had the audacity to argue that Britain, England, should trade freely with the French. This was an absolutely astoundingly loco idea for this crazy Scottish economist to be saying that we should trade freely with the French. The French were, for centuries, had been the most bitter enemy of the British. Wars on and off again for hundreds of years. And this crazy guy, he's like, yeah, but his argument was the same argument we use today when we teach class. Yeah, but their wine is better and cheaper than our wine. And you know, we'd be better off if we bought their wine. I mean, we're trying to grow wine up here, and it's really expensive, and it's not very good. Right. And they would like wool, because it's not very easy to grow wool, some parts of the mountains maybe, but we're really good at making wool up here in northern, in England and Scotland. So maybe we should just send them wool and they send us wine, and they'll be richer and we'll be richer, we'll all be richer. This is the same argument we teach in Econ 101. And so he was a free trader. And that's a tough argument in his time, and it's still a tough argument, isn't it? If you were to survey most of the members of the United States Congress, you would find very few true free traders. In fact, if you surveyed most voters in this country, you'd find very few true free traders. So in this area, we measure things like tariffs. Like those are taxes on imports. So World Trade Organization, God love them, they have this book that I can buy and it tells me all the tariff rates for all the countries in the world. Countries with more tariffs, higher tariffs get lower scores. We also have some things about capital controls. A lot of governments will interfere in the ability to invest, not just trading goods, but also the ability, the freedom to invest in other countries. And so we have capital control data in the fourth area as well. So the more open to foreign trade countries get better scores, the more closed off economies to the rest of the world get worse scores. And then lastly, it's the regulation of credit, labor, and business. It's a whole bunch of variables trying to measure different regulations. Regulations are very hard because each country's regulations, it's hard to compare to another country. Every regulations are very idiosyncratic. But there are some regulations that almost everybody has kind of the same, like minimum wages. Some countries don't have them at all, but we can measure minimum wages across different countries. And that's a regulation that interferes in the ability of people to buy and sell labor. We look at that as a violation of Adam Smith's principles of free markets, of system of natural liberty. The business regulations we have, for example, include a measure of how long and how costly it is to start a business. And so the World Bank also does this thing where they estimate how long it takes to start a business. And I think they try to start they don't actually do it, but they actually go through the mental process of what it would take to start like a warehouse. So, you know, not a nuclear power plant or a hospital or anything complicated, just like a warehouse. And they estimate for the United States that it would take 30 days to open a warehouse, legally, to do the legal process. And that sounds about right. I mean, I don't know how, warehouses aren't that complicated. You probably got to go to the courthouse a couple times, maybe the tax office, fill out a few forms, you know, pay $25 here, $75 there. You can probably be in business for a few $100s. Maybe you got a little zoning meeting you got to go to. They estimate it takes 30 days and isn't terribly expensive. A few years ago, it was going to take, I think it was $900 US and 42 procedures, and it was going to take 3 years to do it in Egypt. 3 years to start a warehouse? Who's going to do? No one's going to do that. So if you were an Egyptian, also $900 is a lot of money to Egyptians. So like, who's going to stand in 42 lines and fork over all this money and take 3 years to do it to start a business in Egypt? Well, the answer is no one. Or they're going to do it illegally, without the paperwork, or they might do it legally, but they'll bribe their way through that process. They'll shorten that 42 procedures and shorten that 3 years to a more reasonable time frame by bribing through the process. So that's just to give you an idea. So what kind of countries do the best in the index? Those that keep their governments relatively small in a tax and spend sense. They don't tax too much. Every country has taxes, but they don't tax too much. Taxes are reasonable. They have a court system that works and settles disputes. People don't worry about, you know, people welching out on contracts and the government not enforcing the contracts. They think their monetary and their price system is going to be stable enough so that your bond or your mortgage contract doesn't get eviscerated by inflation. It's free to trade with foreigners. You can trade with other people in other countries. And it's pretty easy to do business in terms of regulations. Minimum wages aren't too high. Business regulations aren't too bad. Those are the countries that do well on the index. So here's quiz time. I am a college professor, so I'm obligated to give at least one quiz in a class. What's the freest economy in the world according to our index? Somebody has cheated. Yeah.
Singapore?
Singapore's number 2. So you're right on the same. Anybody have a guess? Very much like Singapore. And I might have some people quibble, yeah.
Maybe
Hong Kong, yeah. Hong Kong is number 1, and I realize it's not technically a country, but I mean, they have their own GDP and their own dollar, and it's a country in my world view. So yeah, Hong Kong is number 1, and they've always been number 1. And if I think about the list of things we just went through, the top tax rate in Hong Kong, the top income tax rate is 20%. Billionaires, that's the maximum rate. Hong Kong billionaires pay a top rate of 20%. In the United States, depending on what state you live in, that top tax rate could be 50% in California or Massachusetts. Property rights, Hong Kong has excellent property rights. They even wear like powdered English wigs, very English there. I've actually been in Hong Kong court, and it's very strange. Listening to them speak Cantonese, but looks like an English court. Monetary system, it's tied to the dollar, so there isn't much inflation problem. Maybe I should say yet, but you know, very stable monetary system. They have 0 tariffs, no customs duties, no quotas. They have no international trade restrictions at all. They get a 10 out of 10 on those variables in our index. They are true free trade, just like Adam Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations. How many days it takes to start a business? Remember, it was 30 days in the US. The World Bank number for Hong Kong is 1 day. They estimate it takes 1 day. And it's 1 piece of paper. There's 1 piece of paper. Again, even if you wanted to create a nuclear power plant in Hong Kong, there would be more paperwork. But like a normal, simple, just want to start a small business, 1 piece of paper, 1 day, and you are in business. It's a matter of, it would take longer to get the business started than it would take to get the paperwork done. So I knew Hong Kong was going to be number 1. And they are, and that's good. Singapore is very close, in terms of the data, they're very close to, I think the top tax rate in Singapore is also 20%. They don't have any tariffs and quotas either. Most of their numbers are very close. In terms of the index, Hong Kong gets about a 9 out of 10, and then Singapore's a little bit lower than that. We measured this very precisely, 8.81. I can tell you it's not that precise, but you know, that second digit isn't very meaningful, frankly. And then it goes to countries that you probably would think of. If I were to just poll generally, hey, what countries are the sort of most free market, most market-oriented? Yeah, they have taxes, they have regulations, but which ones have those sort of least taxes, least regulations? The most, you probably, okay, yeah, New Zealand, Switzerland. There's a weird one there. In the United States, we're 6th. Ireland, Lithuania is a little bit weird too. Australia, Denmark. You go below that, I think United Kingdom and Germany are in the teens. Now, there are a couple weirdos, 2 former Soviet republics in the top 10, Georgia and Lithuania, and I've gone to Georgia many times. I've lost count how many times I've been in Georgia. And I was actually in Georgia when the Russian war in August of '08 occurred, so I've been, with the Ukraine thing, I've been thinking about that a lot right now. But those are fascinating case studies because Georgia, especially Georgia, was a Soviet, I mean, the Soviet Union took over Georgia in 1921, so they were a Soviet republic for 70 years. And before that, they were a colony, essentially, of the Tsarist Russian Empire. So they essentially had not been an independent country for 200 years until '91. And then they had some civil wars, which you may or may not have heard of. But around 2004 or 5, they elected a sort of market liberal, almost libertarian government. And they began a series of reforms, and that's one of the reasons I started going to visit the country. Did a little advising, but mostly I was doing just lectures to students. And I got to watch Georgia, which obviously coming out of Soviet times, we didn't have a number for the Soviet Union. because all that number, all those data, World Trade Organization, World Bank, World Economic, all the numbers that I get, they didn't do that stuff in the old Soviet Union. So I have no number for the Soviet Union, but on a scale of 10, let's just make a number up. 3, 2, okay? 2.72, whatever, okay? Today, Georgia gets an 8.5, 8.26, 8.25. That's amazing. It's only 4 million people in the whole country, so it's tiny, but there's no country on earth that I think has gone from as far away from Adam Smith to as close to Adam Smith as Georgia has done in the last 15 years. It's an amazing story. And if you like wine, they invented wine in Georgia. So if you're a wine snob at all, you really should put Georgia on your tourist map as well. At the bottom of the scale, we have 165 countries. At the bottom of the scale, you'll see Venezuela is dead last. And that is, what is their score? 2.83 out of 10. That is the lowest record score we have ever recorded in the history of our index, going back to 1970. Again, I didn't have Russia, I didn't have Mao's China. To this day, I don't have Cuba, I don't have North Korea, because we don't have data for these places. So there are places worse than Venezuela today, but I don't have numbers for them. So Venezuela, among the countries we've been able to rate, that 2.83 is the lowest score for any country at any point in time. And it's been tragic to watch because their number had been as high as like 7. And it's just been this free fall in the last 15, 20 years. You'll see at the bottom of the list a lot of countries in Africa, some in the Middle East. Not terribly surprising. Here's some numbers just for the larger, more significant countries, the sort of most populous nations, or at least more significant ones. Again, the United States is 6. We've kind of been bouncing around a little bit, but we're kind of stably now around there. We had been as high as 3rd for a long time. We went down to like 12th or 13th, and then we've come back to 6th. The US score has gone down though, so it's an 8.25, and it's down by about 0.5 point. And 0.5 point is pretty meaningful on our index. Our index goes from about, as you saw, it goes from about 3 to 9. So 0.5 point is a meaningful, number. And then you see Germany is 22nd. Chile is the highest rated Latin American country, at 29th. Peru is pretty close, but Chile's typically the most free economy. Then you'll see the sort of social democracies, what we usually call social welfare states. You'll see them usually in the next tier, Italy, France, Mexico. I think Sweden's in the 40s now. The colors are indicating quarters, though. So the blue means you're in the top 25%, green is the second quarter, yellow, and then red. We had to use red for the bottom, of course. It's an old. China is still is red, so I get a lot of questions about China. You've heard about all the free market reforms in China, right? And, well, yeah, if Mao's China is your starting point, I didn't have a number for Mao's China, but Mao was a 0.5, out of 10. During the Great Leap Forward, it was a 0.5 out of 10. Then they started the reforms under Deng Xiaoping in '78, and they allowed private property again. They authorized people to start their own private businesses, and they started to open up trade avenues with the rest of the world, as we have all seen. And so now their score is, 6.5? That's not very good. It's actually in the bottom 25% of the country's scores. But 6.5 is a heck of a lot better than 0.5 or 1.5 or whatever number it would have been if I could have scored Mao. So China is, I think, actually evidence that economic freedom can work, even if you don't have a lot of it. At least, there's always, some. So the liberalizations in China, I think, have done some good. India is the same thing. Same story in India. Their ranking's a little higher than China's, but it's the same story there. They started out so low, and they've liberalized parts of the Indian economy, and they've come up. That 6.5 you see for India, 6.6 it says. I need to resort those. They're not in the right sort. Oh well, that's all right. There's the map. This is the cover of the book. So if you have a country you care about that I didn't mention, I can probably get to within 10 ranking spots of where it is, just off memory. But you can sort of see the blues are the top 20. So blues and greens are the top half, the yellows and reds are the bottom half. And you can see, the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe is blue or green. Latin America, you see Peru and Chile are blue, but a lot of Latin America's, some of Central America's gotten pretty good. But Argentina's always been in the bottom 25%, always. Very heavily regulated, very government-centric economy in Argentina. And then you see my favorite area to look at, I don't know if this is going to show, but my favorite area to look at is the old Soviet Union. You see those are the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Down here is Georgia and Armenia, they're blue as well. But then you see Russia itself is yellow, meaning they're in the sort of third group. And then Ukraine, which was in the news, of course, Ukraine is hard red. So I've got a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainians, but their economy has not really changed a lot since Soviet times. They kind of changed the letterhead, but it is still a completely government-run, government-dictated economy. It's not a Marxist, communist party anymore, but the economic system of Ukraine is completely dominated by government decision-making, even more so probably than Russia. I've been working a little bit with some reformers in Ukraine, but it's a very tough place to do business. Africa looks really awful, a lot of red, yellows. There are some greens. Botswana, Zambia are green. But there's some hidden good news here. The good news is, although Africa tends to be in the bottom half of the index, and a lot of them are in the bottom quarter of the index, the good news is the numbers are getting better. They used to be 3s and 4s, and now the worst ones are 4s and 5s, and some of them are 6s. So there's been a lot of liberalization in Africa, a lot of movements away from government planning, government control of economies, towards a more open, market-oriented economy. It's still got a long way to go, but it's been a move upward in Africa. I'm actually very bullish on Africa. I think that we're going to see parts of Africa, particularly the parts that are more green than red, but we're going to start seeing parts of Africa take off economically in much the same way we saw some of the so-called Asian tigers take off in the 90s and the 2000s. You know, countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines that sort of just had these growth spurts, and without exaggeration, millions and millions of people went from really seriously poor conditions to conditions that were at least, livable, in many cases more than just livable. I think we're going to see the same thing in Africa, particularly former Anglophone Africa. South Africa's got its own special problems, but Botswana, Zambia, Kenya, Ghana, these countries especially, I think are going to start performing well if we ever get out of the current crisis. That is not investment advice, just for the record, though, just in case. All right. So let's cut to the chase here. At the end of the day, we've got this index. It's a measure of how close countries are to Adam Smith's system of natural liberty. And you probably are going to know where the punchline is going to go here. Who was right, Adam Smith or Karl Marx? Yeah, Adam Smith was right. The top graph here is the GDP per capita on average. I'm using the same categories. The blue is the top quarter, green, yellow, and red are the next 3 quarters. I can do this much more scientifically. For those of you who are masters of students in economics, I can show you regressions with t-statistics and all that fancy stuff, but no one else wants to see that but like 4 of us. So we're going to stick with bar charts. But the bar charts tell the same story that we can tell with the more fancy econometrics. Those countries that are closer to Adam Smith's system of natural liberty, as we've measured it, their wealth of the nations are higher. They're more productive economies. The average income in the blue countries on that map is about $50,000 per person. That includes Georgia. I think GDP per capita in Georgia is only like $6,000. So Georgia's bringing that average way down, but because it's only recently become economically free at all. So anyway, as you can see, as you go down to the lower free countries, countries become less rich. And that certainly would not have surprised Adam Smith. He wrote a whole book about it. But it probably would not have surprised Karl Marx. Karl Marx actually understood that capitalism created a lot of wealth. His big complaint was that all the wealth would go to the concentrated rich, to the elites, to the powerful, and whatever. So the next chart is the share of income that goes to the bottom 10% of the population. This is data from the World Bank. And so you take the population and then you only look at the bottom 10%. The question is, what share of all the money do the bottom 10% get? Now, if we had perfect income equality, the bottom 10% would have 10% of the money. But we don't have perfect income equality anywhere. So the data from the World Bank say that the bottom 10% of the population have let's see, in the red countries about 2.5, and the yellow ones 2, 2.5, 2.5. It's pretty much 2 to 2.5 everywhere. There is a lot of income inequality in the world, and a lot of people care about income inequality, and I count myself among them. But here's the bad news. I'm not really sure what causes it. I do know one thing. I do know that the type of economic system you have, whether you have a government-controlled system like the red countries have, or a less government-controlled economy like the blue countries have, doesn't seem to matter as far as income inequality is concerned. There's a lot of it. I think we should care about it. We should work on maybe fixing it, whatever the word is. But economic freedom and the economic system we have doesn't seem to matter. And there's a lot of studies now that have been done to pretty much back that up as well, not just simple bar charts. But of course, where would you rather be in the bottom 10%? Hong Kong or Venezuela? Well, given that Hong Kong's average income is, 30 times whatever Venezuela, or 20 times higher than Venezuela. So the bottom 10% have on average $14,000 per person in blue countries. So I wouldn't want to live on $14,000, just for the record. That's not rich. That's, in my world, that's poor. But $14,000 sounds a lot better than $1,500, which is what the average bottom 10% of the population in a red country, they only earn about $1,500. That's desperately poor. Yeah, there's income inequality, but if you care about the absolute standard of living of the poorest people in any country, the blue countries are coming out on top there. The next one is poverty rates. These are the more formal World Bank poverty rates that you probably have heard about. These are the extreme poverty rates based on how much you earn in a day, $1.90 a day, $3.20 a day, or $5.50 a day. So how much money you earn. And the same story, countries that are blue have lower poverty rates in an absolute sense. My favorite chart is life expectancy. It's gotten a little bit better even for the red countries, but it used to be about a 20-year gap between the blue and the red countries in life expectancy. Now it's only about a 15-year gap. But still, if you live to be 80 years old, as the average person in the blue countries does, if you live to be 80 years old, you will live long enough to see your grandkids be born, your grandkids will grow up, and you probably will see your great-grandkids be born, and maybe even your great-grandchildren grow up. My daughter is 26, and my grandmother just died. So my daughter, as a 26-year-old adult human being, knew her great-grandmother. Now that's a blessing and a treasure that very few people that have ever lived on this planet can say they had. And we all now, because we live in a relatively rich and free economy, we've got a pretty good shot at that. Unfortunately, if you live to be 65, which is the average life expectancy from birth, you'll live to see your grandkids be born. Maybe you'll see them as adults, but probably not. Okay? Not for very long anyway. So I'm not a grandparent yet. Alan's made me very jealous. He's told me all day about his grandchildren living here in Boise, and I know from every grandparent I've ever talked to, it's one of the life's greatest things that can happen to you. It's a shame that you can't become a grandparent without first being a parent, but when I see that life expectancy chart, that's what I think of it. That's your odds of seeing grandchildren and seeing great-grandchildren, and that's a blessing that, unfortunately, a lot of people don't have. The last chart is infant mortality. The United States is famous for its relatively high infant mortality rate. I think the infant mortality rate for the United States per 1,000 live births, I think it's about a 7.9. So we actually bring that average up. The average blue country is about a 5.3. So the U.S. is a little bit higher than average. But still, compared to green, yellow, and red countries where infant mortality is still a very serious problem, even the U.S. is doing pretty well. All righty, what else do I got? School enrollment. All right, I'll skip over that. Let's talk about happiness. I hate happiness indexes. I do an economic freedom index, and I think economic freedom indexes are a little sketchy, frankly, even though I've spent my career doing one. Happiness index really are sketchy. I'm like, I don't know what happiness, how do you put a number on that? I think I'm like a 4 right now. In an hour and a half, I'm going to get to a nice restaurant and have a drink, and I'm going to be a 9 then, though. So I don't know what happiness indexes mean, but they have these surveys, and they literally are what they sound like. They simply ask people. The wording will vary from survey to survey, but it's like, how content are you? How satisfied with you? Or even how happy are you? And every time I give a talk like this, I didn't have this chart, someone would always raise their hand and say, what about those happiness indexes? Like, all right, dang it, I'm going to put the graph in. And I was very happy, I'm happy to report, as intended, that in countries that are more economically free, in countries that are more like Adam Smith's system of natural liberty, the people in those countries report themselves to have better life satisfaction, better happiness scores. And it goes down as you go down to the other countries. I don't know what that means, to be perfectly honest, but someone might ask, so I figured I'd head off that with that. There is good news in the world. We have in my lifetime, I became an economist around 1992 when I got my PhD. So these data here start in 2000, but in my lifetime, we have seen an explosion of movement towards economic freedom. Taxes have come down all over the world. Tariffs, thanks in no small parts to the World Trade Organization, tariffs have come down. Inflation, again, until very, very recently, inflation has come down throughout the world. Regulations have come, I mean, we have witnessed a movement towards Adam Smith's system of natural liberty, and the average score for all the countries, I think there's 100 countries in this data here, the average score has increased quite markedly. What is it, a 6.6 up to a 7. If you go back to 1990, I lose some countries because I don't have all the countries back then. If you go back to 1990, you'd see that trend continuing. So it's about a 1 point increase if you use 90 as the starting point. So a lot of movement towards liberalization, and that's, at least for those of us who think Adam Smith was right, this is sort of good news. I want to talk about 2 special topics, and then maybe we'll go to some questions. A lot of news, I mean, before COVID anyway, there was a lot of attention on Hong Kong. You may have seen the demonstrations in 2019. The data that we have only go to 2019, so we really only captured that a little bit. But if you look at the Hong Kong graph, you see it kind of doing its little jaggedy thing. And pretty good scores though, you know, high 8s. But then in the last year, we saw this dip. And so one of the things we're going to be tracking, and as we do the index this year and next year, one of the things we want to try to track is what is happening on the economic freedom side. Now, this is an economic freedom index. We have nothing in our index about civil liberties, freedom of the press, freedom of journalism, and freedom to protest and so forth. We're not touching that at all. We know that situation has gotten worse in Hong Kong. We're just looking at taxes and capital controls and tariffs. But we're starting to see, even in Hong Kong, sort of a general downward drift in Hong Kong's numbers. So I'm pretty concerned. We sounded the alarm in the book. We wrote up a sort of almost a full page, kind of sounding the alarm that this country that had, or this place that had been #1 in our index, literally every year since we did it, like all the way back to 1970, Hong Kong has always been the highest rated country. And we started to put like a warning, shot, like, hey guys, this is not going the right direction. And Singapore might get to be #1 here if this trend continues. Hong Kong government was not happy with us, but we just call it the way we call it. So, there's big concerns about Hong Kong. Unfortunately, our data are lagging a year or 2 or 3 years always. And with COVID, actually it's worse because a lot of the data sources we use are actually still on hold. So my lag, which used to be a 2-year lag, is now going to be a 3-year lag, I'm afraid, as these other entities are taking their sweet time about getting their numbers out. So Hong Kong is one of the areas that we're really focused on. It's the highest rated country, and it's just a lot of attention. It's worthy. The other one, of course, is the United States. As you can see, the United States in the 70s, after the 70s, especially the Reagan Revolution, the lower tax rates, the reduction in privatization, different things. The US score improved through 90. In the 90s and into the 2000s, it was kind of And then we had a big drop during the financial crisis of 08 and 09, when the government mainly just threw money at, raised spending like crazy and did a lot of new regulations, especially in capital controls. And then it got a little bit better, and now it's probably going to get worse. I don't know what's going to happen with COVID, because again, I'm just now going to be putting in, this year I'll be putting in 2020 numbers, but again, a lot of my numbers are going to be lagging, so even there. So I'm still not sure what COVID's going to do, but I have some numbers on government spending already, and I can tell you it's not good. The U.S. score is going to go down in that very first area, that size of government area. The U.S. score is going to go down by 1.5 points in that one area. I've already got those numbers in. I don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the index, but I expect the U.S. is going to go down. Now, it may not affect the ranking, because if every country's done this, we all just go down, the ranking doesn't change. But the numbers, the ratings are going to be much lower in 2020. And then next year when I do 2021's data, as a reaction to COVID. And that's not a knock on governments and what they did. I'm just saying that's the reality of it. All righty. Oh, that's a little bit of that. I don't want to talk about it. We have a website. I think this still works, but if you just, no one uses URLs anymore. We just all Google, right? So if you just Google Fraser Economic Freedom Index, you'll find us, Economic Freedom Index of the World. But this is our old URL, freetheworld.com. And then there's a website there. And if you're in an econometrics class and your professor says you have to run a regression for your final project and you don't know what to do, you can go to the website, and one of these buttons is data set, and you can download our whole Excel spreadsheet and run regressions till your content or happiness. We also have, I should mention, a project that does an economic freedom index at the state level. It's called the Economic Freedom of North America. It's also published by the Fraser Institute in Canada. And that index is authored by one of my people at SMU, Dean Stanzel. That's why I hired him. But he's the primary author of the Economic Freedom of North America Index. And it does an index for the 50 United States, I think 11 or 12 or 13 Canadian provinces, and I think 25 Mexican states. It actually is Mexican states as well. So there's if you're interested in this economic freedom index thing, we have now indexes of economic freedom at the national level and now at the subnational level. And if you go to my website at SMU, Dean also has a city level economic freedom index, a MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area Index. Dallas is like 6th. We're great, so move to Dallas. Boise's probably good too, though. I'm pretty sure Idaho any city in Idaho is going to score pretty good, I think, on that index. So we're all about economic freedom indexes, and then giving the indexes to the world so you all can argue about them. But hopefully, instead of calling each other names like Commie Pinko or Capitalist Pig, now you can at least have some data in front of you so you can at least argue with data. Maybe we won't settle all the arguments in an evening, but at least we'll get a little closer, and maybe we won't hate each other like we tend to do when we're arguing on Facebook. I'm going to stop talking and open it up for Q&A, and Alan's going to tell me when to stop, right?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So I have a question on the North America Index, the economic freedom by state. It would seem that all the metrics are inverse. So like the GDP per capita, the life expectancy, the school enrollment, it seems like those things are lower in the states with more economic freedom. And also those states tend to be more federally dependent. So for every dollar that they pay to the federal government,
Right.
they get more money back.
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. There's two versions of the North American Index, in part because how you treat federal taxing and spending, do you include that or not include that? So they got these sort of two indexes, like one with and one without. And I could argue, frankly, for both of them, depending on the purpose you wanted to put the index to. But to your other question, yeah, actually, a lot of the higher income states, like New York and Canada, California, score near the bottom of the index. But on the other hand, Florida and Texas, which are not particularly poor, score near the high. And actually, I think it's not inverted. It's much more muted, though. Like, I think my job doing the Economic Freedom of the World Index is a lot easier because the world has variation from Venezuela to Hong Kong, and that's a lot of differences, huge differences between countries. When you're doing differences between states, I mean, most everything about California is also true in Texas. It's like we have the same federal government, we have the same federal income tax, we got the same tariffs, we got the same dollars in our wallets. So inflation is no different in California than it is in Texas. So the variation at the state level is much smaller. So econometrically, it's much harder to see the relationships in that study. There are, however, pretty good stacks of academic research now. And I don't think it's as overwhelming as my index, but it's pretty strong. You know, most, like, growth is higher in the country. I keep saying countries because that's my index. But growth is higher in the states that have, even though they may be, like California may be richer than, say, relatively free Idaho. But growth is higher in Idaho than it is California. So the growth numbers are consistent with the general story that we're telling. But I'll freely admit that the relationships are not nearly as strong at the subnational level as they are across countries. And that's, you know, it's just the way it is. So I do agree.
It makes those states more federally dependent.
Well,
More economic.
well, I mean, there's two things that drive federal dependency, or federal transfers or federal spending is either being poor, because the federal government will spend more, they'll send more Medicaid money to a poorer state. The other thing is military bases. And that's a big source of state federal transfers. So Texas, we got, you know, a whole bunch of them, Fort Hood and a whole bunch. And a lot of the southern states have a lot. So, the unevenness in federal money to states, which Dean always uses the non-federal index, because he thinks the federal numbers pollute the state numbers. So he doesn't use them very much. I probably would, most of the time, wouldn't use them. But it's the combination of lower income gets you more federal money, and if you happen to be in a state that's more where they've got bases, you'll get more federal money. Yes?
So, just talking about like government spending, like wasteful spending, the U.S. military has probably, I think it's more than the next 9 countries combined, like as far as the budget goes. And there's, you know, just a large pool of public money that goes there. How does that factor into the U.S. like index? Because a lot of those other countries who are U.S. allies, so I was curious how.
Yeah, in terms of our index, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. If you spend it on a useful thing, or a thing you might think is useful, it's still a dollar. And if it's spent on a wasteful thing, it's still a dollar. It doesn't matter to us. For us, the issue is not so much about what the money is spent on, is who's doing the decision making. So we're interested, the idea of economic freedom as we think about it is that resource decisions about how to use resources, are those decisions being made by individuals who own those resources, or are they being made collectively by typically the government? And so all resources that governments gather, those decisions are being made centrally, so like central planning. So it doesn't matter, you know. I absolutely think there are some government spending programs that are better than others. Some are absolutely wasteful. Others are probably only slightly wasteful, and some are maybe even objectively good. But we don't really care, because we're not so much about the efficiency of the government spending as who's doing it, like what's the locus of decision making? Is it private and decentralized, or is it public and centralized? So that's the margin that we care about, which allows us to not have to worry about that too. So I mean, the U.S. is, I don't know. Some countries is probably worse. Like some countries will have small government spending, so they get a pretty good score, but then they waste it all. And that's terrible. We really don't capture that. Yeah. I'm going to answer a question that's related to that. We get a lot of questions about, well, but the government spending was good. Like, yeah, roads and bridges are great. I drive on them myself, right? I like roads and bridges. I get annoyed at potholes too. Fix the potholes, please, right? So we're not really, in this index, we're not so much about whether the government spending was a good idea or a bad idea. That was still government spending. It was still centrally planned decision making. So this index is about sort of what proportion of economic life is centrally planned versus privately and decentrally planned. And that doesn't mean government's always bad. So. Keep going.
Does that get tricky with like places like China, that it's like a very blurry line with private companies that
Yeah.
basically will do things at the behest of the state but aren't direct, you know, like there's like huge programs that will get spent that are private but it's technically pushed on by the state?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it definitely, the question is about, does it get weird in countries like China where the private sector still has a lot of influence from the public sector can influence the nominally private, and that's true, it's true in the United States too, but it absolutely is a concern. I'll give you another related example is Singapore. Singapore is second on our index. I have no problem calling in Singapore the second most economically free country on earth. I mean, they have no tariffs. I mean, it's pretty economically free there. But their pension system is where they require people to send money to the government for their old age pensions, their Social Security type of thing. And then the government controls those portfolio investments. So the Singapore government has a huge influence in capital allocation because they control all of these Social Security funds. Now, they're private. I'd prefer their system over our system, by the way, but that's not what Adam Smith would want. They won't want the government deciding which shopping malls get financing and which ones don't. But the Singapore government, because it has such a heavy hand in the pension system, can influence that, and that's a negative. I don't really, but I'll be the first to admit, we really can't capture that in the index as we've currently structured it. It's just something we just miss. So, and there's a lot of those kinds of things. Every country has these little idiosyncratic things we just can't get, you know. Yeah.
Because the dollar is attached to oil somewhat, does shocks to the oil supply affect the soundness of money in the index?
Well, I'm not sure. How do you mean attached dollar is?
Oh, like the petrodollars.
Yeah, I mean, those countries that are oil centric, you'll see that, and it's a little bit unfortunate. But like, if oil prices go up, Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Kuwait and Oman, well, their government spending suddenly increases. Russia, for that matter, their government spending starts to increase. And it really wasn't that they decided to become a bigger part of the economy. It's just that, well, they just have more revenue. Over the long haul, that kind of averages out. I don't worry about it too much. We've really looked at that in depth as to what oil prices do to the index. There's quite a large amount of academic research that looks at things that cause the index to move, and I've seen somewhat use oil prices, but I think if you do it with all the countries, you don't see it because it's not affecting most countries. I wouldn't be surprised if you just focused on those. You probably saw some influence, and that'd be bad. I'd rather the oil prices not influence my index, but it's going to be pretty hard when almost all government revenue in Saudi Arabia comes from royalties off of the oil production. I mean, it's going to have an influence on at least on their government spending, that first area. Probably not the rest, but so yeah. But the United States, we're a big oil producer, but it's a small part of our economy, so I don't think it'd be noticeable. Even in Texas, it's not noticeable anymore. The Texas economy does not move up or down much with oil prices. We like them to be higher than lower. We're weird. We're sellers, not buyers in Texas. But when oil prices went down, the last time they went down big, it didn't cause us any real big problems. So we're diversified in Texas now.
Well, with that.
All right. Thank you all.